was Shaumpishuh? She was the hereditary Sachem, or chief, of the Menunkatuck band of the Quinnipiac people who inhabited the shoreline region of Connecticut at the time of the arrival of the English Puritan colonists. They lived in an area roughly from West Haven to Clinton, up to Cheshire, Wallingford, Meriden, and even up to Southington, an area of over 300 square miles. I want to give you a little bit of background about who the Quinnipiac were. And I like to show this slide simply because the Quinnipiac were the descendants of indigenous people who had inhabited what is now Connecticut since the end of the Ice Age, over 14,000 years ago. And I love this little map here simply because it kind of outlines the different years when the edge of the ice existed. So you see, for example, where Long Island is today is basically what was pushed down by the glacier as it came all the way down from Canada. And that's where the glacier actually stopped. About 20 to 26,000 years ago, the shoreline of what is now North America was 60 miles to the south of what is now Long Island. And then as the glacier began to retreat, you see those different little lines here and there, and I always like to point out, let's see if I can point out where Guilford is here for all you folks. Of course, here's Guilford right here, and it's really interesting because when Glacial Lake, Connecticut was here, a lot of what is now Guilford and Madison was underwater. Here's New Haven Harbor. We're going to be celebrating our 275th anniversary as an independent country next year. And it's really kind of exciting time for us all. But when you think about the fact that people have been here for 14,000 years, that's a long time. And, and one of our goals in terms of this project is to actually recognize the fact that they were here and that they contributed a tremendous amount to what our community is today. And I always like to show this little timeline once again. I won't dwell on it, but once again, when you're looking at 14,000 years ago with people here, the Paleo-Indian period, then the Archaic period, then the Woodland period, and then you get here to 1493, and then you get to 1633, and this is the contact period. So you can see, just looking at this timeline, the extent of the time that the indigenous people called Connecticut home. Now, the Quinnipiac lived in harmony with nature, and this is a really important concept. In terms of the physical world, they believed that they were part of nature and not separate from it. They considered all living and non-living things to be their relatives. As a matter of fact, they considered humans to be the youngest of all creatures on the planet, and that we had the most to learn from all the other relatives. And they only took or collected what it was needed, which is an interesting concept compared to sometimes how we operate. Their spiritual world, everything, they believed that everything that exists had spirit energy. It was important to maintain a balance and harmony between the temporal, physical world and the spiritual world. If that was accomplished, everything would be fine. Everything would work well. They lived within a pattern of reciprocal relationships. So, for example, in hunting, part of the issue of you just don't go out and hunt a deer, but you approach the deer and ask permission of that deer to actually kill it. And if that happens, the first thing you do is you thank the deer, and you go through a little bit of a ritual. A whole different way of operating compared to us. They lived a seasonal a lifestyle based on seasonal migrations. In the spring and summer, they had different routines that they went through. In the spring, they migrated to the shoreline and the tidal rivers, and then they collected shoots, leaves, tubers, wild plants, and then they planted and tended the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash. They collected shellfish, adronomus, and salt water, and they hunted and they trapped. And then in the summer, the Quinnipiac remained in these summer camps and villages. They continued to gather wild plants and fruits, collected acorns and seeds, collected shellfish and fish fresh in salt water. They hunted and trapped, and they harvested and processed the Three Sisters. Now, the reason why I'm going through this is because their lifestyle was based on these seasonal migrations. So they would be here along the shoreline during the spring and summer, but then in the fall and winter they'd go inland, and this talks about the different activities that they had there. This plays an important role in the English attitude and when they get here in terms of land use for the native people, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I love this picture. This is by an artist named David Wagner, who lives out in eastern Connecticut, and I will always think to myself, what is that dog saying? What is he thinking? This map is a map created based on the voyages of Adrian Block. Sorry, mental block there. No pun intended. And this shows the coast of Connecticut right here with Long Island Sound, and then you get all the way to the Cape Cod. This is what the Dutch considered part of New Netherland. They claimed the land from Cape Cod all the way down through New Jersey and Delaware and into Pennsylvania. Okay. The most important thing about this map and the most important thing about Adrian Block is that when he left what is now Manhattan, he was the first European to actually sail along the coast of Connecticut. And as he went, he recorded all the names of all the different groups that he encountered. And he also sailed up the Connecticut River as far north as basically as the Enfield Rapids, where he had to stop. But the fun thing about it is that way up here, which you guys probably can't see, it says Quirkies. And that's the Dutch name for what we now call the Quinnipiac. And that's still to this day their dialect, or was their dialect in the Algonquin tongue. Now, the Dutch were the first Europeans to arrive in this area, you probably all know. They're based in what is now Manhattan or New Amsterdam, and their goal was to trade with the indigenous people for furs, and they wanted to cut timber. Now, back in Europe at the time, most of the fur-bearing animals had been killed off, and a great majority of their forests had been timbered off. So this was a gold mine for the Dutch, and just so happened that the greatest fashion, gentlemen, if you really wanted to be cool, you had to have a hat made out of a beaver pelt. And so it was a big business for the Dutch to bring back the fur back to Europe. As a matter of fact, in 1620, they took out of the Connecticut River alone 20,000 beaver pelts, just to give you an idea as to how many beaver were here, but also how lucrative it must have been for the Dutch. And by the early 1610s, they had actually established a trading port on what is now Indian Neck. I don't think I did a talk about that for you guys, did I? Oh, there's another one. Okay. This map is really kind of fun because it was drawn by. This is a copy of it, obviously, but it was drawn by Ezra Stiles, who was the president of Yale University, and at the same in the late 1700s, he was also at the same time remained a minister in Providence, and so he would travel back and forth between New Haven and Providence on a regular basis, and he was a serial chronicler. A journalist, and wherever he went, he wrote down information about the communities. He drew maps, etc., and he drew this map of the Indian Neck section of Brantford. And right here in the thinnest part of the peninsula, he made a little X and he said Dutch Fort. And for those of you who know the folks over at Brantford, they've always believed that the Dutch were there. Back in the late 1998, 1999, I was part of a dig where we actually did find that Dutch fort. And the artifacts dated between 1550 and 1620, which was really tremendous. We found the remains of parts of the wall and a building that was in the interior. But here's the important thing from the point of view of the Quinnipiac, and it'll also be important from the point of view of who Shaumpishuh was and how the Quinnipiac reacted to the arrival of the English. Because on that map you may have noticed there was a section. Let me go back quick. There's a little section over here that Ezra Stiles wrote down. He said the Ministry of Indian Lands, about 400 acres. Okay, the Quinnipiac village of Totucket was located on Indian Neck, right next to that Dutch fort. And this is an important idea because what that did for the Quinnipiac is it gave them access to European trade goods. It also provided, they provided obviously beaver, otter fur for that trade, and they became comfortable living side by side the Europeans. They're the first actual people in Connecticut and probably most of New England to actually experience living next to Europeans. Now, for Shaumpishuh, we believe that she was born right around that time, right around the time of, and she either before or right after the Dutch arrival. Her uncle was Quassaquanch, and he was the Sachem of Totucket, so he was the chief in charge of that area. And once again, Shaumpishuh, like the rest of her people, became familiar with living next to Europeans and the benefits of living next to them. The interesting thing about this period was that by the early 1620s, the Dutch had worked out a deal with the Pequot, where the Pequot would monopolize the production of wampum beads. What had happened is the Dutch had figured out that people in the interior of North America, the Iroquois, even people way up into Canada and as far away as the Great Lakes, greatly sought these beads. They're made out of from whelk shells and quahog. And what had happened was only the people who lived along Long Island Sound could produce these. And of course, the Quinnipiac were part of that production. Well, what happened is the Dutch worked out a deal with the Pequot where if you can secure us a ready supply, a constant supply of wampum beads, we will only trade with you, and then you can distribute those European trade goods to other native people who you forced to make wampum beads for you. And what had happened by around the early 1620s is the Pequots subjugated the Quinnipiac people and forced them into a tributary relationship where they had to provide wampum and also beaver pelts to the Pequots, who would then in turn trade with the Dutch, and then the Pequots would then turn over European trade goods to the Quinnipiac. And this didn't just happen to the Quinnipiac; it happened to all the other native people in Connecticut, going all the way up to Springfield, what's now Springfield, Massachusetts. And at that point, what happened was the Dutch abandoned their fort at Indian Neck. So, right around that same time, you can see, the arrival of the English. The Plymouth colony was established in 1620. Then by 1630, you had Massachusetts Bay Colony. What had happened is they soon realized they challenged the Dutch in terms of the trade for beaver and wampum beads. And so the people of Plymouth established a trading house in what is now Windsor, Connecticut in 1633. That was followed quickly by the people from Boston establishing one in what is now Wethersfield. And by 1634-35, you had English colonists moved from Boston, the Massachusetts area to Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. They also in 1635 established, a separate group established a fort at Saybrook, on Saybrook Point. Now the important thing was this. These folks, the English, were aggressive in their policies towards the Native Americans, unlike the Dutch. Because unlike the Dutch, who just simply came to trade and wanted to live peacefully with the native people in order to obtain the goods that they produced, the English came to stay. And their goal was basically to create a new England. And so this created a whole different type of dynamic and pressure in terms of all the indigenous people, especially the Quinnipiac. I love this. This is one of the last of the Dutch maps. And the fun one about this one is you can see down in the bottom here, you've got Guilford. This is about early 1660s, right before the English took over all the Dutch property in the New World. Here's the House of Good Hope, which the Dutch had established in 1632, and then you have all the other little the English towns here, and everything is in Dutch. And here, right here, is Quirpy, the Quinnipiac. Here's some more Quirpies, and Rogenburg here. This is New Haven. Here's Guilford, and then where's Pawtucket? There's Pawtucket right there. Now, this is where things get interesting, because two incredibly catastrophic things happened to the indigenous people of Connecticut in the early 1630s once the English and the Dutch were here. In 1633 and 34, a smallpox epidemic broke out around the Hartford region. The Dutch blamed the English blamed the Dutch, of course. And what had happened is it spread so quickly that by the end of 2 years, anywhere from 50 to 80% of all the indigenous people in Connecticut were dead. It's an incredible thing to think about. The Quinnipiac, that appears, lost somewhere around 80% of their people. So when you think about how we suffered with COVID and how horrible that was, can you imagine two things? First of all, these weird alien people with a weird alien culture and advanced technology showed up. And at the same time, this devastating disease comes through and kills 80% of your people. Talk about trauma. I can't even imagine how these survivors dealt with this sort of thing. And this is what Shaumpishuh was able to navigate as one of the leaders of the Quinnipiac people, which is, for me, a phenomenal thing. The other absolutely horrific disaster that took place for indigenous people in Connecticut was the Pequot War, and I'm sure you folks mostly know about Pequot War. And if you don't, I'm not going to go into it much because I could go on forever. However, what had happened, there were a number of different issues going on back and forth between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Pequots, mostly struggling over domination of the Connecticut River Valley. And Massachusetts attacked the Pequots and then went home. By then, there was a small English garrison at a fort in Old Saybrook, about 20 men under the leadership of Blind Gardner. The Pequots looked around and said, hey, we're the next easiest Englishmen to go after. They attacked that fort, and they besieged it for 7 months. Wouldn't let anyone in, wouldn't let anybody out. Okay, eventually what happened is they abandoned that siege and attacked Wethersfield, which then brought Connecticut Colony into the war. What happened is Connecticut Colony allied with Uncas and the Mohegans and a bunch of Connecticut River Indians, surprised a Pequot fort in Mystic, Connecticut. They attacked it in the middle of the night. This is a drawing actually done by one of the English commanders, John Underhill, excuse me, where you can see the Englishmen surrounding the fort, the Native Americans as the second line of attack and defense. And what had happened is the English tried to fight their way into the fort. The Pequots repelled them, so they set the fort on fire. And when people tried to get out, They killed them. Most people died in the fire. The Pequots to this day really have no idea. They estimate anywhere from 400 to 800 of their people died. Most of them burned to death. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because the way the English fought terrified the Native American people, because this was completely off the charts in terms of their method of warfare. And so when you couple smallpox killing 80% of the people, these strange people that are aggressive and have this strange culture showing up, and then you see how they fight. If you're a leader, what's going to go through your head? Are you going to be challenging these people? Are you going to try to work something out? One of the most famous Native American people from this time period is Uncas. And Uncas realized that siding with these Englishmen was the best thing he could do to preserve his people. And that's why the Mohegans to this day are still viable and are still there. By the way, I have to tell you, only because I think this is kind of cool. One of the members of our committee, I don't know if any of you folks know Kevin Brown, who lives in town here. I think he lives on Podunk. He is the 13th his 13th great grandfather is Uncas, which is really kind of cool. So, what was the impact of the Pequot War on the Quinnipiac? As tributaries of the Pequot, they were supposed to fight on the side of the Pequot against the English. However, the majority of them fled, as you can see here. Fearing the Pequot retaliation, they fled and joined their relatives, the Wangunk, who lived in the area from Middletown up through Hartford, and under the protection of the English Connecticut colony. And they stayed there until the war was over. Then they returned to their homeland here along the shoreline. Now, Shaumpishuh more than likely joined them. And once again, she saw the benefits of living next to the European from the point of view of trade and for protection. The war ended in 1638, and almost immediately after that, 5 ships showed up in New Haven Harbor in 1638, and with the idea of settling and making a plantation or colony in where now New Haven is. Now, at the time when these English colonists arrived, there were probably an estimated maybe 400 to 500 Quinnipiac left. Remember, this is after that devastating smallpox epidemic where they had lost 80% of their people. The thing that was interesting about this is that these English settlers or colonists were squatters. They had no title to the land. Most English colonies, you had to have a charter from the king. These guys just showed up. Okay, so they figured, all right, how are we going to do this? Well, let's negotiate with the native people, and we'll get what we call a title of the land from them. And that's pretty much what they did. And the 1638 treaty was exactly that. And this is the first and probably the most crucial treaty in terms of the settlement of the shoreline area. John Davenport and Theophilus Eaton represented the colonists. These guys were like hardcore Puritans. And the tribe was represented by Mamoigan, who was the Sachem of the Quinnipiac band in the New Haven area. He was also called the Grand Sachem, the overall chief of all the Quinnipiac. And then along with it, they were also represented by Shaumpishuh and the other counselors who you see is God, I'm going to mess up all those names, so I'm not going to say them.
I was waiting.
But the interesting thing about this is that the English, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, but they bring their concept of legal land property ownership. And so they approach this from a legal point of view based upon creating what they would call a treaty. I don't think certainly the indigenous people at the time wouldn't have called it that. And this is the exact wording on this, and I think it's kind of an interesting take on where the English were coming. Now, the English wrote down that they're talking about Mamawagan, he said Sachem, his council and company do jointly profess, affirm, and convent that ye said Mamawagan is the sole sachem of Quinnipiac, and hath an absolute and independent power to give, alien, and dispose of, or sell all or any part of the lands of the Quinnipiac. And son that though he have a son now absent, yet neither his said son nor any other person whosoever hath any right, title, or interest in any part of the said lands, so that whatsoever ye forenamed sachem, his council, and ye rest of ye Indians present do and conclude shall stand firm and inviolable against all claims and persons whatsoever. I'm having trouble reading this. This is being read to the Quinnipiac. Okay, now it's being translated by a guy by the name of Thomas Stanton, who had learned the Algonquin tongue from up in the Boston area. And he was a fervent, I hate to say it, Indian hater. Okay, but he's the one who's translating this to them. But the important thing is that they're writing down that Mamawagan is the sole owner of the Quinnipiac lands. Okay, now, first of all, Native American people, we'll get into this a little bit in a second. Native American people had no concept of land ownership. There was that was a completely alien idea. It's like trying to own the air or the sea or anything else. There was no such thing as land ownership. However, a sachem in the lands that he controlled or she controlled could designate where people could live. And this is an important difference. So the English are taking that concept but turning it into the English point of view. The fun part about it is this. Just when they were ready to get going, the second paragraph, guess who speaks up? Shaumpishuh. She says, wait a minute. And this is the first thing she says, and then it goes on from there. But she says, so they write down, secondly, he said Sachem, his council and company, amongst which there was a squaw Sachem called Shaumpishuh, sister to ye Sachem, who either had or pretended some interest in part of ye land. Boom. So she said, no, wait a minute, he doesn't control everything. I do. I have a pony in this race as well. And then she says, and they write down, remembering and acknowledging the heavy taxes and eminent dangers which they lately felt and feared from ye Pequots and Mohawks and other Indians, in regard of which they durst not stay in their country, but were forced to fly and seek and ease, yet other Indians enjoy near ye English, of which benefit they have had a comfortable taste. Okay, so she says, wait a minute. First of all, I have authority here as well, and not only that, if you guys are going to stay here and we're going to share this land with you, okay, we expect protection from our enemies, and we also want the benefits of trade with you. Okay, the men didn't say this. Mamawagan didn't say this. His other counselors didn't say this. She said it, which was really an important thing, and Thomas Stanton wrote it down, which is really important. Now, the English presented what they considered to be, what are considered to be gifts. You can see them listed here: 12 coats of English trucking cloth, 12 spoons, 12 hatchets, 12 hoes, 24 knives, 4 inches, etc. Now, here's the thing. When indigenous people to this day make an agreement, guess what they do? They exchange gifts. That's part of what they do, okay? Where the English saw this as payment, and they wrote that down as such, okay? And this is an important difference between the two cultures right off the bat. So what happened eventually is the English agreed to create their little village here where the New Haven Green is today, okay? And the Quinnipiac remained in their village, which is now in this section of New Haven, the Fairhaven area. This is actually Townsend Avenue here, for those of you who are familiar with New Haven. And this is Indian Hill, which is Fort Worcester City Park. And in Fort Worcester City Park, there's a lovely, well, not really lovely, but there is a monument to the Quinnipiac there. It's a little too nice from my point of view, but you know, the person who paid for it was the one who got the idea in terms of design. And the names of all the Quinnipiac sachems are on the bottom of that with their what they call mark. And Shaumpishuh's mark is a pipe, a peace pipe, which is, I'll get into that a little bit later on. Oh, by the way, part of the treaty or the agreement that the English wrote said that, oh yeah, we're going to be here, you're going to be here, and you guys can you can go all your land all the way over to the Connecticut River and use that, okay, because you know that's yours to use. So for the Quinnipiac, this isn't such a bad deal, okay? They got these English people living with them that are going to protect them and trade with them. And they still have their village here, Menunkatuck it's called, and they can really come and go throughout all their territory. And so what basically happened was, this is a map from John Venta's book. You have basically only 4 villages left, because once again, remember, 80% of these people have died, okay? And there's 4 main villages. There's the main one here in New Haven with Menunkatuck at Menunkatuck. Montowese is up here in North Haven. The English record that he only has 13 people left in his village. But he's a real character. He actually sells what is now Wallingford and Meriden to 3 different groups of Englishmen separately. He's a character. His father was the sachem in what is now Middletown, Mattabesset. Here's Menunkatuck, or on Indian Neck. Now, at this point, Shaumpishuh is here. So these are really the 4 main villages that exist by the time 1638, 39 come around. I'll get to this one again later. Now, the big question becomes, why did the Quinnipiac agree to allow the English to settle among them? Okay, well, there's a Quinnipiac perspective, and we get a lot of comments about this up at the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum at the Dudley Farm, because people when they encounter this, they're always sort of surprised. Oh, wait a minute, okay, now I get it. But from the Quinnipiac perspective, the agreement was written by the English and promised a protection from the enemies, and that was important, as well as trade. Now, this is the other thing that's really important to understand. In the Algonquian culture, the people who from Nova Scotia and that part of Canada, down through New England, all the way down into the American South, and all the way to the Great Lakes, these are Algonquian people, except for the Iroquois. And they have a cultural tradition that if somebody comes to you and says, I need a place to live, you give them a place to live. So from the point of view, the Quinnipiac, when the English show up, that's what they're doing. They're just following their cultural tradition. And they see the benefit of living with these people. And then the Quinnipiac did not believe in land ownership, only use. And that's the other thing that I want to emphasize. The English perspective, the English cultural tradition is exclusive land ownership and private property. The English legal tradition of purchasing land and possessing a title. And then the belief that land not made productive in the English manner was open for theirs taking and use. Now, the reason why I showed you that seasonal migration stuff is because here in Guilford, or we should call it Menunkatuck then, there was a village, Shaumpishuh's village. In the fall, they left. Where'd they go? They went inland. They went up as far as Cheshire and Wallingford and those areas. And they lived there in the winter. And so the English would look at this and say, they abandoned their land. Okay? And also, the Quinnipiac are not using the land the way English people do. The English are going to create farms, they're going to cut down the trees, they're going to build roads, they're going to do all that sort of stuff, but fence in their private property. They don't see the Quinnipiac doing that, and therefore they don't consider the Quinnipiac as utilizing the land in the proper manner. Therefore, in the English idea, it's open for taking. Okay, so when the Quinnipiac are gone, they're gone. Let's take it. The Quinnipiac come back. Who's there? English people. Now, so this is really sort of an interesting dilemma that they ended up finding themselves in. Now, right from the beginning, the English dictated what they considered to be the rights of the Quinnipiac and also restrictions. And they said that the English had the right to free access to all fishing and hunting, free access to all the meadows, free ability to cut timber anywhere, free ability to let their livestock roam unfenced. This becomes a major problem, not only in the New Haven area, but here in Guilford. The Quinnipiac agreed to, and New Haven agreed to live on 1,200 acres on the east side of the harbor. They had free access to their traditional lands east of the, all the way to the Connecticut River. They could hunt freely, but not set traps anywhere near where the English livestock was. They could not disturb the English wares, and this is my favorite one. They could not enter the English town or houses during the Sabbath without permission. Because the fun thing, once again, these Quinnipiac do not understand or the English concept of a private property. So when they go walking into New Haven Village or later Guilford here, they kind of show up. They open the door and sit down and start eating. Or they might pick up something and say, "Wow, this is nice. Can I have it?" That kind of thing. I mean, they're just a whole different thing, and it freaked the English out, especially during the Sabbath or Sunday, because they're in church all day. They don't want these folks walking into their houses and sort of taking stuff, which I thought was kind of humorous. That's right. Okay, so here we go. Now we're going to get into Shaumpishuh. So how does she fit into this story? First of all, she is the Sachem of Menunkatuck. She is the chief here, okay? And she is part of a hereditary family that has the lineage of Sachemdom going back in time, okay? She has the power to designate land use in Menunkatuck. Okay, so if you come to her and say, "I need a place to plant my corn," she says, "Yeah, you go over there. That's your place." Okay, that kind of thing. She's the one who makes that decision. And that her brother, Menunkatuck, is the grand sachem in what it was called Menunkatuck or New Haven, East Haven. Her uncle's Costa Conch, who's the sachem of Tuckett. And I believe Montalise may have been her cousin, but we have no proof of that. And then from a young age, she saw the benefits of living peacefully alongside Europeans, first in Tuckett with Indian Neck, and then the Dutch fort, and then later with the English up in the Hartford area. You guys all know this one, right? There you go. Okay. So what had happened was this. When Henry Whitfield and his gang, and you guys probably know the story better than I do. When Henry Whitfield and the gang showed up, okay, they first showed up in New Haven. And the idea was they wanted to set up their own plantation, separate from the New Haven people, okay, their own place. New Haven people wanted them to stay there, but Whitfield and the gang said no. The first place they checked out was Milford. Nice, mouth of the Housatonic River, you got a nice harbor, pretty cool place. But they, and Dr. Brapkin here, who's on our committee, he says this better than I do, but they decided to look around. And Shaumpishuh met with them and took them, guess where? Here. Now, when they came here, they were shocked because the area which is from the West River, which used to be the Menunkatuck River, all the way to the East River was called the Great Plain because the native people had cut the trees and those were their planting fields. And when the Englishmen saw this, they said, "Wow, this is great. It's already open. We can make our village here." And guess where they centered it? Right in the middle of the Great Plain. And guess what you now call that right in the middle of the Great Plain? The green. There you go. Okay, so there you are. Now, the interesting thing is that Shaumpishuh had the authority and the right to designate what, based on her culture, letting the English live here. Okay, that was their tradition. And the fun thing about this agreement is the fact that, of course, English always want the native people to sign it. Okay, because you sign it, that means it's real. You agree to it. Of course, they don't write, so they would make symbols. I mentioned before in New Haven, Shaumpishuh's symbol was a peace pipe or a pipe, right? Well, here's her. She's the only native person to sign this agreement, okay? And they write down Squaw, Sachem. They don't write her name. They don't write Shaumpishuh. And I love her symbol, bow and arrow, which is probably the most powerful symbol that you could possibly, And this is just a translation of the. I used to make my students read that, by the way. And I wouldn't let them stop until they actually did it, which was great. And they were pretty good. The best one was a kid who had a severe dyslexic issue, and he could read these things like you wouldn't believe. I still can't figure it out to this day. But anyway, so here's the English once again, and I just highlighted some of this. First, that the Sachem squaw is the sole possessor and inheritor of all the lands lying between the Kudawell and the Oikmont River. Now, the Kudawell is now East River, and the Oikmont River is supposedly Stony Creek. But a group of us are working on that. We don't really think it is Stony Creek. That's another whole story. I can point you to some people if you want to argue with them. And then secondly, the said Sachem squaw, with the consent of the Indians here inhabiting, who are altogether with herself to remove from thence, doth sell unto the foresaid English planters all the lands within the foresaid limits of Kudawell and Oikmont River. Okay, and then of course there's the exchange of these gifts. Okay, and of course they say at the end that she professes herself to be fully paid and satisfied. Okay, now here's the thing once again. The English are interpreting this as they're buying the land. Okay? I'm 99.5%, convinced that the cultural tradition of Shaumpishuh and the Quinnipiac was that they were allowing the English to live where now Guilford is. Okay, the southern part of Guilford is, because of their cultural tradition. And they accepted these gifts here. And then what they did is they moved across, Shaumpishuh moved her group across the East River to what is now Madison, okay, because that was still Quinnipiac land. And before that happened, or shortly after that happened, Whitfield and Company said, just to nail this down, we need a map. And we need a map that designates where these places actually are, okay? And so they asked Shaumpishuh and her uncle, Quetzalcoatl, to create a map. Now, creating a map is a completely foreign concept to a Native American person, okay? But here's the neat thing about this. Shaumpishuh and Quetzalcoatl did it. And what they did is they drew the lines. So this is the shore. Here's Long Island Sound, here's the Thimble Islands, here's Faulkner's Island, and these are all the different rivers and streams. Here's Menunkatuck right here with the little dashes showing the little village. Okay, here's Totucket, Branford, Madison is over here. And so so what they did is they would point to these things and they would say, okay, what's this? And they would say the Oikmont. Okay, what's this? The Kudawell. What's this? And they would write down phonetically as best they could what they heard Shaumpishuh and her uncle say. Okay, this is to quote Dr. Brockett here. This is a national treasure. This thing, because this is the earliest map created by a Native American person, and you guys are selling it back there. How's that? You gotta love it, right? Let's see. Now, what happened was when Shaumpishuh took her people across into what is now Madison, Whitfield then wrote down who was living with her. Interesting thing, only writes down men's names. Okay, so for example, you have Kamasak, you have Aquanu, a blind Indian. This guy is a dumb old man, but he's got a wife. A lot of broken families. Total of 13 men, 8 women, and 12 children. 33 people in all. That was all that was left here in Menunkatuck. Okay, most of them had died, probably during the smallpox epidemic. It's an amazing thing to think, and then Shaumpishuh is thinking to herself, okay, I've got these 33 people. How am I best going to protect them? How about if we live next to these English people, and we'll live just across the river, and we'll live together, and things will be good, okay? By the way, you may notice they don't put her name. They say Sung Squaw. We'll talk about that in a second, but they put her uncle's name. Okay, so there you go. And we'll get into why that is sort of an issue here. So once again, Shaumpishuh is thinking, what can I best do for my people? How can I best help my people? And the reality is, what if she hadn't decided to show Whitfield what is now Guilford? Then Guilford would be Milford. Milford would be Guilford, whatever. See, so it's a whole different situation when you think about how important her role was in actually establishing the English town here. Now, later on, Henry Whitfield added this to the agreement. And I think this one is really kind of cool because it's highly unusual when you look at these agreements between the English in Connecticut and the indigenous people, no matter who they are. He wrote down, Shaumpishuh and all the inhabitants of Kutuo promised their friendship and faithfulness to the English, and I, H. Whitfield, promise the like to them. The said Sachem squaw in her own name and the rest of the above named Indians promise they will not hurt or steal anything belonging to the English, cows, hogs, corn, etc. They shall be punished by Shaumpishuh, not by the English, and satisfaction made to the owners. Then no traps set where the English cattle feed. I'll talk about that in a second. And I also promise in my own name and the names of the rest, no hurt shall be done to them or anything of theirs, and if so, just satisfaction shall be taken. So here, she's been able to get Henry Whitfield to voluntarily vouch, okay, if you keep your people from doing anything that's harmful to us and our property, I guarantee I will do the same for you. It's an amazing thing when you look at other areas in Connecticut, and the relationship was nowhere like that. Okay, now we certainly can say this might have been Henry Whitfield's idea, and I certainly can't say no, that wasn't the case, but I think also Shaumpishuh was the one who set the tone. She's the one who set this peaceful coexistence idea, realizing that would be the best thing for her 33 people that she was still in charge of. Okay, so there's that map that I showed you before. So Shaumpishuh ends up moving her gang from here over to here. And she remained there for 2 years until, I forgot about this one. Okay, why did Shaumpishuh agree to the Menunkatuck agreement? Well, she must have once again seen the benefits. By moving across the Kutuo, her band was still in their ancestral land, which is an important idea. This was a reciprocal agreement with Henry Whitfield for the compensation of damages, and the Menunkatuck could continue to hunt, fish, and gather in what becomes Guilford and North Guilford. Now, this is an important idea, too. There were no restrictions on where the Menunkatuck and the Quinnipiac could go, and they moved in and out of Guilford and later North Guilford willingly, without harassment by the English settlers here. And I think once again that's a wonderful testimony to the relationship that was forged between the Quinnipiac and these early settlers here. But the question always is, did Shaumpishuh have a choice? or was this something she had to do? Was she forced to do? And that's something that some people could certainly argue. So what happened in 1641? Uncas, who had sided with the English during the Pequot War, was given control over all the native people in Connecticut by the Connecticut colony. He said, "They're your guys, you take care of them." And he went on a land grab. Okay? One of his wives was the daughter of the former Sachem of what was now this area of Madison, which he was a sub-Sachem of the Quinnipiac. And they had a son. And the indigenous people in Connecticut and all the Algonquin people were matrilineal people. So you traced your who you were, not through your father's line, but through your mother's line. Okay? So Uncas said, "Oh, I've got a son. It's the son of a woman who used to live here. This is now my son's land, not your land, Quinnipiacs." And for a couple of years, I believe Uncas harassed them, trying to say, "Come on, time for you to leave, time for you to leave, time for you to leave." And I think Shaumpishuh and her people kind of hung in there for a while. And then finally, what happened was there's this, actually one of the documents we have hanging in your town hall here is the Uncas agreement treaty here. Finally, what happens is Whitfield and the boys say to Uncas, "Look it. Other people, including Shaumpishuh, claim that this is their land. You've got to get them to say, no, it's not." And so he does, which is interesting. So here you see that diverse Indians have seen to lay claim to this land aforesaid as the Sachem squaw of Quinnipiac and Wheatwash, I'll get to him in a second, through her right, the one-eyed squaw of Menunkatuck and others. To this he saith that he hath spoken with all the Indians of the Quinnipiac, together with the Sachem squaw, the one-eyed squaw, and the rest, and they all acknowledge that the right of the said land sold by Uncas is Uncas's and his child. Okay? So what had happened is he had put pressure on them all to say, "Yeah, it's your land, it's yours, right, Uncas, it's your land," etc., etc. And so Uncas turns around and sells what is now Madison to Henry Whitfield and the gang. And you can see that where the 1641 is, that's that area, which becomes Madison. He also claims what is now North Madison, that's that 1663 area. So what did Shaumpishuh do? Where did they go? Well, the Menunkatuck band apparently broke up, okay? And most of them joined either the people at Pawtucket or Menunkatuck, New Haven, okay? But they continue to move in and out of what is now Guilford and North Guilford seasonally, all the way into the late 18th century, hunting, gathering wild plants, and things of that nature. Shaumpishuh retained her role as Sachem. She was still Sachem of Menunkatuck, okay? And she became Sachem in New Haven. And she became, for the rest of her life, she was a lead negotiator with the New Haven English. Whenever there was an issue or a problem or a question, she was the one they went to talk to. Okay? Occasionally her brother, and then when her brother died, her brother's son. But she, throughout the rest of her life, was the prime person that the English went to talk to. Okay? Now, she died sometime prior to 1686. Where she was living was probably in what is now New Haven, Menunkatuck. Now, after her death, the Guilford colonists, and it's interesting, they don't try to move into what's now North Guilford while she's alive. And I always find that kind of fascinating. Now, of course, the English Puritans had a organized system of development. You just couldn't go off on your own and make a farm. You had to have land allotted to you by the town, and then you would go as a group to these places. But they didn't really make much of an effort to move into North Guilford. at all while she was alive. But then in 1686, the Guilford colonists were eager to expand northward into what is now North Guilford, and because there had never been a northern boundary to the original 1639 agreement. By 1686, Shaumpishuh had died and was succeeded by her son Nassau as Menunkatuck Sachem, and her daughter Shaumpishuh as Sachem at Menunkatuck or New Haven. So you can see that hereditary line of leadership is being passed on to the next generation. Nassau agreed to cede North Guilford to the English while retaining the right to hunt, fish, and gather, and that's written in the agreement, and addendum to the agreement. Nassau then later established a village at what was called West Pond. It's now Westlake, that extended and that existed all the way into the late 1830s. Okay, so the Quinnipiac hung around here. I mean, they didn't all leave. They stuck around, and the last of these folks recorded to be living in the 1830s. However, at the Dudley Farm, there's this oral tradition, and I may blame Steve for this one because he's the one who used to talk to David Dudley. That at some point in the late 1800s, they would hire as laborers 2 Quinnipiac men who lived at Westlake. Now, we have no proof of that, but it's just kind of interesting that sort of showed up. So they were here, and they continued to be here. Okay, now what do we know about Shaumpishuh? Because I'm sure you're dying to find out, right? Since the average indigenous person was recorded by the English as much taller and much more physically fit because of their diet and their living outside all the time, etc., and just their lifestyle. She was apparently probably taller not only than English women, but probably most English men in particular. Because of her lineage, we like to imagine her as sort of having a regal bearing, okay? You know, as somebody of importance would display herself. Now, we now know, thanks to Dr. Bracken, that she was not missing in one eye. But I never took it out of this. So there was somebody else, another squaw Sachem, who was missing an eye from Totucket. And that because Quinnipiac culture was matrilineal, women leaders were not an exception and often were the decision makers. And as a matter of fact, all major decisions made by any indigenous band, that when the men got together and wanted to do something, the women would call council and they would discuss it amongst themselves. And if the women said no, it didn't happen. And that's sort of that was sort of their tradition. Now, what was the English reaction to Shaumpishuh? And this is the one that we have a lot of fun with. In English society at the time, women were considered the property of their father or their husbands. They had no rights, including property. They couldn't even claim to control, to have rights over their children. Everything was male-oriented to the point where they were basically property for the most part. Okay. In the early documents, including the Menunkatuck Agreement, the English did not like to refer her by her name, but rather as the Squaw Sachem. Don't read the one-eyed squaw, or the Sunk Squaw. The last Sunk Squaw is actually a Quirpy dialect honorific, meaning elevated woman. So in these documents, they did recognize her position within the group by calling her a Sunk Squaw. I love the idea of her toe-to-toe discussing all this stuff with Henry Whitfield. I just find that to be absolutely wonderful. And and to his credit, he obviously respected this woman. I mean, he negotiated with her. And so did Davenport and Eaton, the very powerful Puritan leaders of New Haven. She earned their respect. And why did she earn their respect? Because how hard she fought for her people, and how hard she fought to try to ensure their survival during all this catastrophic things that were happening to them. Okay, and so here's the mark of and signature of Shaumpishuh, once again, that bow and arrow. And that throughout her life, Shaumpishuh signed her agreements with the English with two symbols. One was the bow and arrow, which symbolized her physical or temporal authority in the physical world, and the medicine pipe that symbolized her spiritual authority. Okay, so she wasn't just this woman leader. I mean, she was more than just a leader. She was a spiritual leader as well, which is really a powerful thing to think about. Now, quickly, what happened to, we call it at the Dawnland Museum, the Quinnipiac diaspora, because by the end of the 17th century, the English had successfully transformed the entire region into an English countryside. This made it impossible, or almost impossible, for the Quinnipiac to continue to live the way they had always wanted to live. And they struggled within the new English economy because the only way they could now survive would be hiring themselves out to English people to work. Okay? And a lot of the English farmers and people were really kind of not nice. I have not come across any of these examples here, but in New Haven and Brantford, this was a problem. Instead of paying them to whatever with something, they would give them liquor. And then they would get drunk, and they would get in trouble, and then guess who the English would call to negotiate to get these guys out of jail? Shaumpishuh. Okay? But what happened as a result is the only way the Quinnipiac had to actually pay for all this stuff and function within the English economy was to sell off their land piecemeal. 1 little acre, 2 little acres, 30 little acres, etc. The last 30 acres in New Haven, for example, anybody goes down, Morris Cove area, right? That was the last part, 30 acres that the English had there. And Brantford, Indian Neck was gone by the 1770s. The thing about here is that Nassau's village exists all the way until the late 1830s. Okay? Most Quinnipiac joined other groups in Connecticut or migrated out of Connecticut. There are descendants of the Quinnipiac as far away as Wisconsin, we know. And many of them blended into the English or African families and a lot of them hidden plant site. So I'm almost done, so here we go real quick. Why honor Shaumpishuh with a statue? To honor and recognize the fact that she fought for the rights of the Quinnipiac throughout her life. She sought to live in peace with the English colonists while protecting the rights of the Quinnipiac in a rapidly changing world. She represents the Quinnipiac people and the important role they played in the history of the region. She represents all Indigenous people, past, present, and future. She is a role model for everyone, men, women, and children. During a time of tremendous social and economic and cultural change, her steady leadership for 50 years helped Indigenous people navigate those changes. She stood up for the rights of all her people. The history of New Haven Colony and the Shoreline might have been different if not for Shaumpishuh, and Guilford would not exist as it does today if Shaumpishuh had not negotiated one-on-one with Henry Whitfield. And you can learn more about this by checking out John Menta's book called The Quinnipiac Cultural Conflict in Southern New England. I brought some copies of my book, Shadows Over Dawnland, here, which deals with those first 50 years of the English arrival. And Dr. Michael Bracken's wonderful book, 1639 Reimagined, which I think many of you probably came to his talk last year. And of course, I haven't seen a lot of these faces up at the Quinnipiac Dawnland Museum. It's not too hard to get north of Route 80, Dudley Farm's right on the corner. You can do it. So there you go. But that's it. Thank you very much. And I know